continue with Adam's family. I'm really tempted to whistle the theme tune to you again, but I don't think I will put you through that turmoil again. But you've got to love families. You do have to love them, don't you? I don't know about you, but if your family is like mine, that with families, it's like sometimes you can't live with them, but you know this, you can't live without them. That God's drawn you together, and you can tolerate things in a family much more than you can tolerate things from other people. And what I wanted us to do this morning is just, in a sense, just briefly recap the story of Adam's family, just so we've got a context of what we're looking at this morning. So, I'm going to put it to you this morning, and I'm sure you'll agree as we do this recap, that Adam's family actually is quite dysfunctional, like a lot of families. Lots of things went wrong. People repeated the same mistakes. They made the same sins. They got the same things wrong. And in my family, things happened in my family. When we were younger and all the children at home, you can imagine 5 children, 2 adults, sometimes things got a little tense. There were arguments, there were falling outs, there were bickerings. And my oldest daughter, Megan, who was here just a couple of weeks ago with us, she used to start singing a song when things got a little heated in the household to just try and calm things down, or sometimes it made it worse. She used to go like this. She used to go, "This family's dysfunctional, this family's dysfunctional, this family's dysfunctional." And of course, we would either laugh or we'd get even more angry. It didn't always work. But the thing is this, we all want to live in this perfect household, this perfect family. Yeah, we have this, we used to have this image of, a married couple, 2.4 children, and everything was rosy and wonderful. And the truth is that for most families, life just isn't like that. So, families, Adam's family is just as dysfunctional, perhaps even more so than any other family. Adam and Eve, the first human beings, they were deceived and they fell and they brought sin into the world, and the whole human race fell with them. That's the starting point. After creation, the human race fell from grace with God. We got separated from God because of Adam and Eve and their disobedience. What a great start. It's a terrible start, isn't it? Cain and Abel, their children. Cain murders his brother. Noah, God was used in the redemption purposes of God. But when it was all over, we read actually there was a point, he grew a vineyard, he got drunk, he fell asleep naked in his tent, and his sons had to go in and try and cover him up. He missed it sometimes. Abraham, called out of a nation far away, and God establishes a covenant with him. He's the ultimate man of faith, but he mucked up many times. He passed his wife off as his sister, not once, but twice. He lied. He pretended that his wonderful, beautiful wife was his sister because he feared for his own life more than he was concerned about doing the right thing. He passed off his wife as his sister. He got the wrong woman pregnant, didn't he? He had an Ishmael. And of course he ended up with Isaac and Ishmael. And Isaac repeated some of his father's mistakes. He too passed his wife off as his sister because he was afraid for his life. And then he has the twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Two brothers that are so different to each other. I love it. I don't know if any of you are much into the cinema, but when I was a teenager growing up, really from probably the time I started secondary school, I used to love reading the Marvel comics, the Incredible Hulk and Daredevil and Spider-Man and all these kind of things. So over the recent decades, when they've introduced at the cinema the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I've really enjoyed that. And it's been great for me to introduce my children as they were growing up. We'd watch a film and they'd always do a spoiler at the end, and I'd say, oh, that's going to be, and I'd kind of give them a little bit of a preview because I was familiar with the stories. And one of the stories in the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe is the story of two brothers. If you've watched the films, how many of you have watched the films, the Avengers and Thor and all that like? None of you. 1, 2, 3. There we are, 4. Well, watch them if you want some good entertainment, okay? They're really good. But there's these two brothers, and it's based on the Norse mythology of Odin and all that lot. There's two brothers. There's Thor and Loki. And Thor is the hero. He's big, tough guy. He's got his hammer and he goes around pummeling the enemies. And Loki is at home and he's the schemer and he wants the power and he wants to take control. And that's very much like Jacob and Esau. Esau is the tough guy. He's the hunter. He goes out, and Jacob is the schemer. They were born with Jacob holding on to his brother's heel, trying to grab hold of him. And we read, as we study their life as they go through, and as we come to this point in a minute where I will read the Bible verse in a moment, okay, in Genesis 32 about Jacob wrestling with God. But there came a point where at one point Esau returns to the home and he's hungry. He's starving. And Jacob's got this pot of stew on. And Esau says, oh, give me some of that stew. I'm really hungry. And Jacob says, well, sell me your birthright. He said, oh, come on, I'm really, really hungry. He said, well, sell me your birthright. And he said, well, what's it worth anyway? Yeah, you can have my birthright. He said, well, say it then. All right, you can have my birthright. And he said, all right, you can have some stew. And Esau sold out his birthright with his father for a bowl of stew. What happened on is that sometime later, as Isaac came to the end, he summoned his sons, and Jacob got to his father first and pretended to be his brother. He deceived his father so that his father would lay his hand upon him and pronounce all the blessings of God that should have gone to the firstborn upon Jacob, the secondborn. And he stole. His brother had sold it to him, but he'd actually stolen. He'd schemed it. He'd conned his brother, and he'd taken away the blessing of God. Because you see, the blessing of God was not just words that Jacob was going to speak over him. It was not just, well done, son, I'm proud of you. There were promises attached to it. There were promises that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars, that their descendants would be as numerous as the sand upon the shore. And then when Esau finds out what happens, and as his father passes away, Esau wants to kill him. He wants to kill him. he hates him. I don't know about you, but have you ever been in situations where there has been family conflicts and you just want to kill someone because they have just crossed the line, they've gone way too far, and you think, I've had enough? Esau wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob flees with nothing, and he has an encounter with God at Bethel, and angels are ascending and descending, and God speaks to him even though he's on the run and being pursued or certainly running away from his brother. And then he goes and he works for this guy Laban, and he gets conned, not once but several times, by Laban, and he works for him to gain his daughter's hand in marriage, and he gets the wrong daughter the first time. And then he works another 7 years and he gets the other daughter. So he marries two of Laban's daughters, and then he works another 6 years and he cons Laban back to make sure that he gets more of the flock than Laban did. And so at the end of this time, as we come now to this passage in Genesis 32, Jacob knows he has to return home. God is working in his heart in such a way that he knows that he has to go home. And I put it to you that in the life of every person, and certainly in the experience of every Christian, there is a time when it's time to come home. It's time to come home and face the music. So Jacob leaves Laban. He flees him, actually. He does what they call a moonlight flit. I don't know if you use that expression up here. He went in the night, and his wife took stuff as well that she shouldn't have taken, and they went, and actually Laban pursued them and caught up with them and said, look, what are you doing? And Jacob explained, and they made a covenant together, and he made his way towards his brother. So despite all of this history in his life, all this dysfunctional family tree, all this dysfunctional family life between Jacob and Esau, he knows that he needs to come back home and he needs to be reconciled to his brother. It's a message for all of us just in that, isn't there? That there is deep within inside of us this sense that we need to be right with one another. You know, if you bear a grudge against someone, if you bear any bitterness or anger towards someone and just let that fester in your heart, it doesn't hurt them at all. It just hurts you. It just damages you. So Jacob begins the long journey home. But now he's a rich man. He's got 2 wives and he's got lots of cattle and servants and everything else. And as he begins this journey home, he has another angelic visitation on the way. But now he begins to realize that he's going to be near to where his brother is. And so he sends messengers ahead of him with gifts. And more gifts. And he gets a message back that his brother is coming to greet him. And rather than being excited or happy, Jacob is afraid. Because his brother's coming with 400 men. And he doesn't know if his intentions are good or bad. So, the day before he sees his brother, he sends everyone on ahead of him. And now we come to our Bible passage, Genesis 32. And I'm just going to read a few verses. Genesis 32, verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, He touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So I've given you all the backstory. Here is Jacob about to meet his brother after 20 years. The last time he heard or saw anything of his brother wanted to kill him. Jacob is afraid. He sent everyone on ahead. He is alone. And he's devoid of all his possessions. And you know, that's exactly where God wants to get us, isn't it? Alone and devoid of everything that we have, so that we can meet him face to face. See, the Lord's going to use this experience to change him for good, to change him forever. Now, God's got a plan for Jacob's life, but up to this point, he wasn't walking in it in any way, shape, or form. What was God's plan? Well, we read in Romans chapter 9, it's recapping what God's plan for Jacob's life was this. It says, Romans chapter 9, verse 10 onwards says this: "Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born, or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy." God had a plan for Jacob's life. The older would serve the younger. And there's that outrageous phrase that is a quotation from another part of the Old Testament that we really struggle with, where God says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. What? What do you mean? God's a God of love, surely. He doesn't hate anyone. But God does hate sin, doesn't he? But he loves people. He loves a sinner. So how do we understand what God was saying here? You know, when I look at Esau and when I read that, if I'd known the man, my heart would go out to him. Obviously that wasn't pronounced over his life. I don't think he was aware of that God had said, Jacob of love, but Esau, I hate you. I can't stick you. He wasn't aware of that. But nevertheless, his life was marked in a certain way. In Hebrews 12, verses 16 and 17, it says this: "See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless, like Esau, who, for a single meal, sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterwards, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. This is why God didn't love Esau in the same way that he loved Jacob, because Esau was a godless man. He was a profane man. He sold out his eternal inheritance for what he could have right now. I don't know how you feel about this, but isn't that what most people are like? We're concerned about what we can have right now. Esau was dominated by his senses and his desires. What he could feel and touch, what he desired. Hunger drove him to sell out. And so many of us can be dominated just by our bodily desires. Natural desires, but we let them dominate us. Whether that's hunger and we eat too much, whether that's the sexual desire and we fall into immorality, whether that's a desire for acceptance, but we become people who put down others so that we can be exalted. Here was a man, he was a godless man because he didn't take into account the eternal. And it's so easy to do. The vast majority of the people that we rub shoulders with are these kind of people. They're living for the here and now. They're living for what they can touch. They're living for the next holiday. They're living for going to the restaurant. They're living for going out of an evening. They're living for fun times with their families. And a lot of these things, there's nothing wrong with them. But if that's all you're living for, then you've missed out on the eternal perspective completely. So often we can sell out because of these natural urges. You see, the writer to Hebrews equates Esau's godlessness to sexual immorality. He was dominated by his bodily urges. He was completely controlled. You see, here's the thing. Human beings are different from the rest of the animals, aren't they? Animals are dominated by their bodily desires, aren't they? They do what their urges tell them to do. If they're hungry, they'll eat. Or, if they're like a lion, they'll go hunt to eat. Or, if they're another animal, they'll eat grass or whatever. If they feel they want to reproduce, they'll just go and do it. They'll do what they want when they want. But we, brothers and sisters, we're not animals. Not in the same way. We're created in the image of God. There is a mark of God in us that we are destined for far more than just living for the here and now, that we're designed to live for eternity. But let's be clear. Esau despised his birthright, but Jacob stole it from him. Jacob is not someone who is a wonderful example. His methods were completely wrong. But here's the thing. He had a desire to inherit the blessings of God. He put value on the blessings of God. It's amazing, isn't it, really? Here was this man, he did so many things wrong, and yet his desire, his focus was on inheriting the blessings of God. He just didn't know how that was going to happen. He thought he would make it happen in his own strength. He'd been a crook his whole life. He had lived his life on the run, and he knew God was going to stop him running. Just like we sang in that song earlier, isn't it? The love of God was pursuing him. He was on the run. And now, the night before he's going to meet his brother, God comes to him as a man, just a man, and wrestles him. Now, it was interesting. I was talking about this passage with a number of people before today. And my little daughter, Kristen, who came the other week, she saw how Velko and I greeted each other with our elbows, but probably a bit too aggressively for kind of friendly folk. And she said, "Dad, you should wrestle Velko in the church." And I live in a house, and there was a youth leader, and I was talking, and they said to me, "Oh, you should wrestle Velko in the church." So I was thinking maybe God is saying something, Velko, I don't know. But here's the thing. When I came this morning, I'd prepared all week. I'd looked down at Jeff. There were only 2 or 3 people here, and I saw that Jeff had some notes on this passage. And I said to Jeff, "Are you preaching this Sunday?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "I've come prepared to preach." So then Jeff and I wrestled. No, we didn't. We laughed. And after a while, Jeff said, "Well, do you want to preach?" I said, "Well, yeah, but I'll give way to you." And we're both being very gentlemanly. Anyway, we had a little vote with a few people, and I won the vote, or Jeff lost, I don't know, whichever way. And so it came that nobody had to get wrestled in church, thankfully, and I'm here. But there is a time once when I did wrestle someone in church, in a church meeting, believe it or not. And it was about 7, 8 years ago. I was preaching in a church in Warsaw in Poland, and the pastor there, Andrei Stepanov, he's a Ukrainian guy, an amazing guy. We're preaching at the church, and at the end of the meeting, prayed with lots of people. But we'd met this guy who'd come into the church. What had happened was, before the meeting, we were sat in the office and having a drink and some refreshments and just talking with the pastor. And this young man burst into the office, very troubled, very angry, very agitated. I can't remember his name, but when he realised we were English, he could speak quite good English. But his language was appalling. He was swearing and cursing and everything. Anyway, basically, one of the main factors of his life was that he was a football hooligan. He supported Legia Warsaw, and he used to fight with other football supporters, and that was a big part of his culture. And if you're familiar with football hooliganism, which I know is a very niche interest, but they sometimes what they do is they meet in the forests, and they strip off to their waists, and they'll fight bare-knuckled in the forests, and 100 v 100, and see who comes out on top. These are tough guys. And anyway, this guy, he stayed for the meeting, and towards the end of the meeting, God said to me, "Wrestle that man." And I'm kind of looking up, thinking, "Lord, is that you? Have I gone mad? Well, what do you say? Wrestle him. I want him to know that I'm not going to let go of him." I said, "I can't do that. He'll kill me. He'll beat me up." So I was with my friend Mike Vickers was there as well, and the pastor was there. And I just said to them, I said, "Guys, God's told me I've got to wrestle that guy. I've got to fight him. Will you have my back on this in case it goes really badly wrong? I might need rescuing." And they went, "Yeah, all right, okay." So anyway, so it was the end of the meeting. We'd pray for people. The band was still playing. So I went up to this guy and I said, "Look, God's told me I've got to wrestle you." And he went, "Come on then." So I started wrestling with him. And so we're rolling on the floor, chairs flying everywhere. And of course, people are all looking around thinking, the preacher's having a fight with someone in the congregation. What's going on? Now, I'll be honest with you. Okay, I was 7 years younger, but I wasn't in particularly much better shape. But I did have weight advantage. And if you're wrestling, weight advantage does count for something. I don't know about you. Did any of you, come on, you must have watched the wrestling on World of Sport back in the day. Who watched that? There we are. I see those hands. Thank you very much. Do you remember with Dickie Davis and his funny hair? And you'd watch the wrestling on the afternoon, you know, live from the Civic Centre, Liverpool, or wherever it was. Do you know what I mean? And you'd have Big Daddy. Do you remember him? Yeah, Giant Haystacks. My favourite was Les Kellett. Do you remember him? Yeah, someone's putting their thumbs up because he was a really funny guy and he was always mucking around. But like, I never understood why Big Daddy always won. Because he had no real athletic ability whatsoever, did he? He was just a big, fat, old guy. But one thing he did have was weight advantage. And if he fell on top of you, you've had it really. And so I'm wrestling with this Polish guy. The chairs are rolling around. People are looking around with their teas and coffees thinking, what on earth is going on? And eventually I pin him. And I'm really glad, and I've got hold of him. And he looked up at me, he says, "You fight good for an old guy." And I said to him, "God says to you, I'm never going to let go of you no matter how far you run from me. And you need to know that I love you and I'm never going to let you go." And I got up and I left him. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've obviously never seen that guy again. I don't know what God's going to do in his life, but it was the scariest prophetic thing I've ever done in my life. Because I think the guy, on another day, well, 9 times out of 10, he would have beaten me up, no problem at all. But somehow or other, it came to pass. So here's Jacob. He meets this man in the night, and immediately, initially he doesn't know who it is. But this man wrestles him. And so they're rolling around in the dirt and they're fighting and they're getting dirty and they're fighting in the strength of men and no one seems to be winning. They fight each other to a standstill. Now, the passages in Genesis describe this person as, the angel of the Lord. In my view, when we read about these situations where it's the angel of the Lord, and I said this when I preached on Gideon, it's the Lord himself, it's Jesus himself, pre-incarnate, appearing as a man, just as a man, and he's fighting him in the strength of a man. And when he realizes that Jacob's not going to let go, that he's not going to defeat him, he supernaturally disables him. He touches him on the hip. Isn't it interesting? It's the exact opposite to a healing miracle, isn't it? It's a disabling miracle. How about that? Have you ever thought about that? That there are times when God brings disabling miracles. I can think of one in the New Testament where I think it's Elimas, isn't it? The man is made blind, isn't it? For a while, because God is speaking a message. When that happens, there's clearly a message in it. It's not that God willy-nilly goes around hurting people. Okay, there's a message in it, but it's mysterious. So this man is supernaturally disabled by God. Why? Because he wants to bring him to the place where he wants him to be, at the end of himself. You see, Jacob tenaciously hangs on. He says he's not even sure if the man he's wrestling with is God or not. But then the Lord speaks to him and says, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." You see, commentators speculate, and it was certainly the belief of the day, that if he saw God face to face in daylight, he would surely die. But Jacob refuses to let go. He recognizes the superiority of his opponent, and he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Sometimes the Christian life can be a bit like a wrestling match, can't it? It can be a fight, it can be a battle, it can be difficult. That sometimes, because of all the things that are in our life, we find ourselves actually fighting with God. We're challenging him and he's challenging us. And it's like, who's going to win? Is the will of God, is the power of God going to prevail in our lives, or is our flesh and our soul going to dominate and take over? We can lose everything in life sometimes, but we're gripping hold of God and we won't let go. Have you ever been in that position? I know I have. Where you lose everything and you think, all I've got is to hold on to God and I am not going to let go. I am never letting go. I am not letting go, Lord, until you bless me. That's what God's looking for in our lives. That's why he loved Jacob. Because Jacob said, despite all the things he'd done in his life, I am not going to let go. I'm not letting go until you bless me. And God does bless him with a name change. He says, what's your name? Jacob, which means supplanter, schemer. He says, your name will be Israel. He struggles with God, is what Israel means. He struggles with God. He wrestles with God. And God blesses him. And Jacob calls the place Peniel because he says, I saw God face to face, yet my life was spared. He realized that he had wrestled with the Almighty. You see, God's purpose in our lives today is to deal with us individually, one by one. But ultimately, his plan is to work corporately right throughout the world. You see, Jacob became Israel, a man, just a man. The man Israel became a nation. And through the nation Israel, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come, and through him, salvation would come for the whole world. Through Jesus' birth through the Virgin Mary, his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, which we'll just celebrate in a few weeks' time as we come into Easter time. Through what Jesus did, through his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, salvation comes to the whole earth. Everyone. Hallelujah. But here's the great thing. It's a fantastic story, isn't it? It's an amazing story. But do you know what? I love stories that have got a happy ending. Do you? Because some Bible stories have got sad endings. The Bible's very true. It doesn't sugarcoat things. But there's a happy ending to this series. And there's so much I could have said on this. And Esau, I looked at different things about his life. I could have just done a whole study on Esau. But he's not the focus of the story, but he's a really interesting side character. The passage continues on in Genesis 33. After wrestling with God and walking away with a limp, Jacob goes on to meet his brother Esau. He doesn't know what sort of reception he's going to get. But we read in Genesis 33, verse 4, this. Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. What a beautiful moment. And here's the thing. Despite all he'd done wrong, all the ways that he'd wronged his brother, despite Esau and all his godless ways where he just lived dominated by his sensual desires, God can bring reconciliation. God can restore. You see, what's God's plan for our lives? He wants to bring us home. He wants to bring us home. He wants to establish us in a family. I don't mean necessarily with your brothers and sisters that were born, or your cousins, or your uncles, or your aunties, or your grandparents. He's got a much bigger family than that, the church. All the believers together, all across the world, not just in the town where you live or the village where you live, but throughout the nations. He wants us to bring us home, to be part of the family, to be reconciled to loved ones, to people that we have wronged and people that have wronged us. Adam's family was dysfunctional. We've seen that, haven't we? We've seen they're not a model family by any stretch of the imagination. We look at their lives and there's much that we don't want to emulate. There's much that we shouldn't try to copy. But there are elements of their lives where God said, that's what you need to get hold of. Abraham was faith. Jacob was holding on and not letting go. He wanted those promises of God and he didn't care how he got them. But the important thing is he wanted them. See, Esau sold his birthright. He rejected his spiritual inheritance. As Jeff said right at the beginning of the meeting, that those who received him, Jesus, have the right to become the children of God. And that's our inheritance. That if we receive Jesus Christ, the Son of God, into our lives, we give our lives to him and receive him into our life, we receive. We become partakers of all the promises of God. And we walk and we stand in the family line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the patriarchs. And we become not part of Adam's family, but part of Jesus' family. A new family, a redeemed family. And the great thing is that God will put everything right. I'm just going to finish with one. It's a personal story, really. Probably many of you won't know this, but I was adopted as a child. So I didn't know my birth family growing up. And I had lots of difficult and painful things that happened to me in the developmental years of my life as a child, growing up and as a teenager. And I gave my life to Jesus Christ on April the 1st, 1986. Okay? So 35 years ago, just coming up in a matter of weeks. Okay? I'll have been a Christian 35 years. Not long after I became a Christian, I bumped into somebody who I knew was a birth relative, an older lady. And she said, "Hello, Alan." And I said hello to her. And we were just making small talk. And she said, "I was talking to your sister who's never met you. And she said she'd like to meet you. How do you feel about that?" I said, "Oh, I'd really like to meet her." And so this relative arranged for me to meet my real mother and father and my siblings, who I'd not known for 22 years of my life. And so I went to their home and I visited them and I met my father and my mother for the first time, and I shared my faith with them. And a little while later, some of my sisters came in, who are obviously, they're all older than me. I'm the baby. And my dad says, "Oh, he's a Christian." And my sister said, "Are you born again?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "So am I." And she embraced me. Another sister came in and she said, "Oh, Alan's a Christian." She said, "Are you filled with the Spirit?" I said, "Yes, I am." And she embraced me. I was privileged then to know my father and mother for another about 15 years. And although we were never close, I saw both my father and mother come to faith before they died. I actually was there when my mum got baptised. And I actually found myself in a position where God turned things so around that when my father died and when my mother died, the family asked me if I would take the funeral. And I did. Not easy, I know, but it was easier because I knew they knew the Saviour. That's what Jesus can do if we grab hold of him and say, I'm not the best, I'm the worst, but I'm not going to let go until you bless me. I want to be restored to the family of God first and foremost. I want to be right with God, right with Jesus. I want to hold on to you no matter what.